Hello everyone. Thus far in your course, you have already been introduced to nature and scope of ethics, challenges and importance of ethics, and also ethics in the history of Indian philosophy. Continuing therefrom, I am presenting you the first of a 5-lecture series where you will be acquainted with ethics in the history of Western philosophy. The first lecture, which is this very lecture, will provide you with an overview, and the rest of the 4 will deal with some of the most prominent ethical theories. This particular series will focus on the theories advanced by Aristotle, Kant, and Mill. Today's lecture is an effort to provide a framework to you and a context to orient you to understand ethics in general and normative ethical theories developed in the Western philosophy in particular. Now, a question may arise that why do we even need to discuss regarding ethical theories? What's the need here? What's the point, right? Why do I even care? To make you appreciate the need better, let me begin here with an example. Imagine yourself to be at a traffic signal. It is not uncommon to find someone begging there, is it? Now, this is a situation that often leaves you with a dilemma to choose the right response, whether to give or not to give. I myself have faced it many a times. Similarly, what about the practice of Jallikattu? The court has banned the age-old custom many a times, citing issues pertaining to injuries to both the animals used and the human participants. But the people didn't seem to be in agreement with the same, and the custom continues. So again, the question arises, what is right? Is the practice right? Is the practice wrong? Are somebody's interests being hampered or not? And what about eating non-vegetarian food, for an instance? Do animals have rights? All these instances that we discussed here, right? The practice of eating non-vegetarian food, the practice of Jallikattu, or where you encounter someone begging at the traffic signal. All these instances present us with the question, what is the right course and how can we arrive at one? And these instances, probably more than others. So these are not the only instances where the question of rightness or wrongness comes. There are many instances, right, in our day-to-day life. So when we have grown up listening from our parents that harming people is wrong, right? Breaking a promise is wrong, telling a lie is wrong, telling the truth is right, and so on. But these instances where you are encountering a dilemma probably, now, more than others, they make us realize that our inner lives perhaps can be much calmer, much easier if some general principles are to be in place that aid us in making such category demarcations of right or wrong. Some standards or norms that we can adhere to for the justification of our actions. And this need was felt by many in the history of Western philosophy. And ethics, and to be precise, normative ethics, is a concerted effort to arrive at such general principles that can act as justification for categorizing an agent's acts, beliefs, and attitudes as what? As right or wrong or good or bad. Now, understanding normative ethics in this sense is not very far away from contending that ethical judgment is a special case of an agent's value judgment. And what does value judgment mean here? Well, it is basically judging or assessing something or some facet as, say, beautiful or ugly, worthy or unworthy, or less worthy, right or wrong, desirable or undesirable, etc. So, for example, I make this statement that I like the color blue, or I like the color blue that I am wearing right now. And you are to make a statement. So for instance, there are many friends of mine who find the color blue to be very, very boring. Now, these are statements when I'm talking about my likability of the color blue. What I'm saying is that I attach a particular value to color blue, right? I personally happen to have a preference for color blue. Alright, on the other hand, my friends do not attach the same value to. Alright, they do not prefer color blue. Similarly, the other statement that is written over here, alright, which is what? Modern art form is of little worth. So, most of us, right, have some artifacts at home, some art pieces, Some like traditional art, Rajasthani art maybe, right? Some prefer modern art. Modern art itself may have certain genres. So we have a likability regarding these things, and some detest the exact very same things. So here, what is it that I want to say here is that I am attaching some value to modern art, say, or I am attaching some value to color blue here. Now, given such an understanding of the value judgment, ethics perhaps seems to be a subset of value theory, where what is it that we are doing? What is it that we are valuing? Where actions, beliefs, or attitudes, and maybe agents themselves, they are placed in the categories of good or bad, or right or wrong. However, such an impression may be a bit misleading. This is not to say that ethics is not a part of value theory, it very much is. So, undoubtedly, ethics and other forms of value judgments, such as personal preferences we just spoke of, right, are a consequence of the same human propensity, which is the propensity to organize the world into categories in terms of facets that reflect what we value or prefer. But similarities probably end here. Well, where does the difference lie then? The difference, it seems, lies in how such preferences or valuations are arrived at. Unlike many other forms of value judgments, such as our personal preferences, ethical value judgments in addition require a justification for such preferences or valuation. So for instance, let us go back to the previous examples. So where I am saying that I like the color blue, I do not need to justify my choice of blue here. If I am saying I like modern art over some traditional art form, I do not really need to justify my choice here. On the other hand, if I am saying that I want to steal something from somebody, perhaps a justification is needed, and perhaps no justification can be given. Alright, this is not to say, this is not to argue about whether a justification regarding stealing can be given or not. The point here is that a justification is needed here. Where a justification in the case of where your preference regarding blue is being talked of, right? No justification is being expected from you. You may give, alright, that it appears soothing to your eyes, whatever, alright, but it is not expected from you. If you just say that, I happen to like blue, that's an okay response. That response would be an acceptable one. But in the case of stealing, right, if you just say that, I happen to like stealing, perhaps it is not acceptable by us. Similarly, what are other kind of examples that we can take up here? So, when you are, for instance, eating biscuits, and on the other hand, if you are eating, say, chicken. So, when you are eating biscuit, the question of rightness and wrongness does not arise. What I want to say here is that the question of justification does not arise, right? You seem to like biscuit, you find it tasty, you are eating, that's absolutely okay. But when I'm saying that I like to eat chicken, alright, perhaps there is something bigger at stake. I need to justify my choice of eating an animal. Now, at this stage, perhaps it is reasonable to ask why such a justification is required in the context of ethical judgments. Meaning what? In the previous examples, in the case of blue, in the case of modern art, justification was not required per se. But in the case of you eating a chicken, you stealing, you liking to kill someone, a justification was required. So why is it the case that justification in the context of ethical judgments seems to be required? Well, ethics, it is generally believed, is primarily concerned with how we ought to live, which is definitely asking for preference, very much like other forms of value judgments, but the choices to be made and the way they are to be made involve consideration of human autonomy, rationality, and human interest, and in ways that is unparalleled. And thus arise the need for justification of ethical judgments. And as I have explained earlier, such justifications are expected to be derived from where? From general principles. Now at this particular stage, I have some questions for you to ponder. We talked about general principles, we talked about justification of our actions based on those general principles. The question for you is, can there be some universal principle? Can there be such a general principle in the first place? Secondly, let's assume that such principles are there or can be there in principle. Where do you think your search may end if you intend to discover the legitimacy of such general principles themselves? These questions are beyond the scope of the current series, but significant questions they are nevertheless. Now, in view of the explanations offered thus far, it is now easier perhaps to appreciate why ethics was introduced the way it was introduced earlier. And how it was introduced? So I said that it is a concerted effort to arrive at a general principle that can act as justification for categorizing an agent's acts, beliefs and attitudes as right or wrong, or maybe good or bad. Now, in light of such an understanding, it shouldn't be a surprise that each significant theory that we are going to grapple with in this lecture series, right? So I said that we will be talking about Mill, we would be talking about Kant, we would be talking about Aristotle. Alright, and there are so many other thinkers perhaps we would not be able to deal with because of the paucity of time. The point here is that all the ethical theories that have come, right, in the history of Western philosophy, right, ethical theories in normative ethics, they are an attempt to arrive at such generalizations only. They are an attempt to arrive at such general principles that can be the basis of ethical judgments. They are an effort to come up with certain standards, certain norms that can be adhered to, right, in order to determine whether an action is right or whether an action is wrong. Now, if your memory serves you well, you may find the same in the context of ethics in the history of Indian philosophy, which you have already covered in your previous lectures. So there, for an instance, you did the theory of Nishkam Karma. Now, this theory of Nishkam Karma acted as a general principle, right, as a standard, as a norm, prescribing to act without any desires for the fruits of the actions. So again, we are talking about what? A general principle, right, a universal principle, a standard which can justify our particular actions as right or wrong, good or bad. Now, having explained to you what such theories generally seek to achieve, I intend to lay before you how they all fit together in a philosophical landscape. You may do well here to remember that much of the character ascribed to these theories is derived from the overall philosophical undercurrents of the period of which they are a product. Therefore, if such theories are seen devoid of the historical context in which they emerged, such a description may not be able to serve its purpose efficiently, which is to provide you with a framework to orient you and navigate you through what will be served in the subsequent lectures in the series. Thus, I'm offering you here the historical context that imparted these ethical theories that we are going to discuss with some of its salient character. So, it begins with ancient Greece because we are talking about the Western world, alright. Now, ancient Greece, as far as the recorded history goes, is the place where the seed of the philosophical attitude was sown for the first time in the Western world. And what is this attitude, specifically the philosophical attitude? Well, apart from the general curiosity to understand the phenomenal world in general, it also involves harboring a healthy skepticism for what is already considered to be known or given. It involves challenging the conventions, traditions, and customs and subjecting them to a critical scrutiny. The later Greeks actualized this attitude by devising a structure called argumentation, where claims or conclusions had to be supported by premises, and the sanctity of such arguments relied on the logical connection between such premises and the conclusion. Now, this need for justifying claims, right, with the help of certain reasons, manifested in a culture that prompted dialogue. So, there are many eminent philosophers in this era. Specifically, if I am to talk about the later Greek era, right, post-Socratic era, then there is Socrates who is always in search of definitions, right, where he is trying to define what justice is, knowledge is, virtue is. So the word definition is important here. Why? Because we are talking about here again general principles, right? So here for Socrates, perhaps it wouldn't be sufficient if you will just give him an example of justice, if you are to define justice, he would want you to define it in the most abstract way, in the most general way, where every case of justice may fit in. Alright? Similarly, if you talk about Plato, Plato has written innumerable dialogues. And this attitude that we are talking about here, the philosophical attitude, the attitude of argumentation, right? It is, you can see the imprint of that attitude in almost all the dialogues, right? Where it is not the case that there are just claims on claims and on claims. The claims are supported by reasons. And then those reasons are challenged by the interlocutors. And then better reasons are to be found out. Similarly, if you talk about sophists, now they were the teachers of their time. What is it that they taught? Amongst other things, they taught how to argue well, how to reason well. And then what about Aristotle? Alright, now he happens to be somebody who has given a formal structure to argumentation, right? He is formulating the laws of reasoning, right? And logic that he has given is taught in the universities even in these times, and it is absolutely relevant, right? Even to this time. So what I want to say here is that this was the era where people really started to do philosophy. And when I'm saying that, it is not to say that everyone, all the Greeks were doing philosophy, right? Many were still governed by the mythologies of their times. But people who we study as philosophers, right, who have been part of this era, right, somewhere or the other, they used this method. Now, given their tenacity, it's not a surprise that they led the search for the general principles that could justify ethical judgments. And distinct contributions in the direction can be witnessed from the time of Democritus, but the most notable contributions, it can be argued, came from Aristotle, Epicurus, and Stoics. This era was guided by that philosophical attitude, and the imprints of that philosophical attitude could have been seen when these people, Aristotle, Epicurus, Stoics, right, when they are giving their ethical principles. You would see that they are looking at things critically. They are not being governed by the mythologies of their time, right? Rather than they are trying to question the existing norms. They are really trying to analyze the situation. They are trying to come up with their own argumentation to come up with their own general principle that can justify an action to be right or wrong. Now, this classical period was followed by what has also come to be called as the Dark Ages. This was the period when much of the philosophical attitude cultivated in the classical period, right, that we just talked about, that not to take anything on face value, that attitude of challenging the existing norms, right, that attitude of scrutinizing, absolutely. This particular attitude was somewhere or the other obscured by the elements of religious faith and dogmatism in the Western world. And every aspect of individual life, almost every aspect I should say here, every aspect of individual life and associated economic, political, socio-cultural interactions came to be dominated by religious considerations. Well, it shouldn't take it to mean here that justification for ethical judgments were renounced. We still wanted to justify, alright? And even if you go back to the Greek era, when I'm saying that the philosophical attitude for the first time was seen in that Greek era, it is not to say that the notion of it, you shouldn't be confusing it with that the notion of right and wrong wasn't there. The notion of right and wrong has been there since the time the society is there. Alright, so the notion of right and wrong was there, still there, perhaps, but then they didn't really feel the need to come up with the general principles, which perhaps could be seen in the Greek era. Alright, now in this era, what I'm saying is that it is not the case that justification for ethical judgments were renounced. Now they were still trying to justify, but these justifications, they were coming from the religious texts, they were coming from the scriptures, their varied interpretations, or from the authorities that have been designated, that were designated for such interpretations. And any contraventions or challenge to such justifications were not entertained. Now the notable thinkers of this era happen to be St. Augustine and St. Anselm, amongst others, and you would see that their philosophical doctrines, including the ethical positions they held were hugely influenced by scriptures. And again, just to recapitulate, what is it that we want to say? This era was influenced by somewhere or the other religion, right? And that influence of religion could be seen in their ethical doctrines as well. Now, the next marked change in the historical context, right? So after the classical era, after the Dark Ages, so the next marked change in this historical context came in the age of Renaissance. Now, the age of Renaissance has been a turning point in the Western world in most senses. And it doesn't differ in the context of the philosophical attitude that emerged in the classical era, which means that philosophical attitude that we discussed about, right, was present here. Now, although that classical era was subsequently shrouded by the religious dictates of the Dark Ages, as we came to know, alright. Now, Renaissance marks the rediscovery or reintroduction of those classical texts and associated wisdom to the Western world that was lost for a millennia to them, but was cherished, protected, and translated in what has come to be termed as the golden era of Islam in the Middle East. This reintroduction of classics led to the reflections that paved way for the reappearance of classical elements in almost all walks of life. Art, literature, language, and other elements of culture bore the imprint of classics, and philosophical attitude did not remain aloof, and contemplations on ethics likewise benefited from it during the period. Reliance on argumentation once again became a means to arrive at general principles from which ethical judgments could be justified. And if you talk about the notable thinkers of this era, alright, so St. Aquinas and William of Ockham were two of the notable thinkers of the time. And the influence of Renaissance can be clearly observed in their works. The most significant outcome that stemmed from Renaissance has been probably the Age of Enlightenment, which happens to be in the context of the historical context that I'm laying out before you, right? The next era. Now, this era of enlightenment, it is characterized by humanism and reliance on reason. Now, humanism brought human to the center stage of life, where human agency, human autonomy, capacity to reason, and human potential were valued over mystical and otherworldly considerations. Once such elements were given weightage, the meaning of what constitutes a general principle for justifying ethical claims attained a new dimension altogether, where human interests became the subject of a reason-driven pursuit. Now, adopting the same philosophical attitude that was mentioned earlier, the one that Greek philosophers introduced to the Western world during the classical period, earnest efforts were made in this period to arrive at such general principles. This era, in most other regards, became the most fertile period in the said direction to achieve the said objectives. And what are the said objectives? To come up with the general principles. Alright, that can justify your actions to be right or wrong, good or bad. Now, the landmark contributions in the era of enlightenment came from many people, and specifically in this regard, right? So, for instance, Thomas Hobbes, Kant, Mill, amongst so many others. Now, again, to recapitulate, so the era of enlightenment again forced with their focus on humanism, with their focus on reformation, right? Somewhere or the other, it guided the thinking of these thinkers. Alright, so overall, what do I really want you to take out from this subpart, where I'm trying to acquaint you with the historical context? That all the theories that were developed, right, in the history of Western philosophy, they were developed in different eras, right? They were a part of different culture. So these theories were governed by, or guided by at least, right, by the culture they were a part of. Alright, now in the subsequent lectures, we will now be dealing in detail with some of these key efforts to advance ethical theories themselves. And I have told it to you in the beginning itself that this theory would be focusing on the theory of Aristotle, right? The theory of virtue ethics by Aristotle, and theory of deontological ethics by Kant, and utilitarianism by J.S. Mill. And I really hope that I have made it clear by now that such efforts, right, by all these thinkers, for instance, have been mostly about arriving at general principles. Likewise, the historical context is a valuable aid to understand the overall philosophical undercurrents of an era which has undeniably left its imprint on such efforts of theorization. Thus, if you keep these facets in mind, you will be able to orient yourself much easily in the subsequent lectures. Also, I hope while following the lectures, you adopt the same attitude that has been mentioned earlier, the philosophical attitude, right? Which is to have skepticism for what I present, alright? Meaning to critically scrutinize all the theories that will be advanced and the premises supporting them. And to try and come up with your own reasons to support or challenge a particular theory maybe. And if possible, also try and frame your own argumentation on a given topic where conclusions follow from some well-considered premises. Alright? Thank you very much.